5:30 in the morning. Ilion, New York, August 1916. Steam rises from the Mohawk Valley as 3,000 men file through iron gates into a factory so large it has its own canal. Inside, forges glow orange in the darkness. The rhythmic pounding of drop hammers shakes the floors, metal against metal. The smell of oil and hot steel hangs thick in the air. Somewhere in the belly of the building, a furnace reaches 1800 degrees, and men work bare-armed beside it, their skin glistening, their lungs filling with particles they will carry for the rest of their shortened lives. This is Remington, 100 years old in this moment, the oldest continuously operating firearms manufacturer in America. By the end of this single year, they will have produced more rifles than any company in human history. They will arm the armies of 4 nations. They will employ 17,000 workers across 2 states. And they will help win a war that the world promised would end all wars. It did not. Remington armed America through every major conflict, from the Mexican-American War to Afghanistan. They produced the revolvers that Union soldiers carried at Gettysburg. They built the rifles that doughboys fired in the trenches of France. They manufactured the ammunition that stormed the beaches at Normandy. For 207 years, the Remington name meant precision, reliability, and American manufacturing at its absolute peak. And now, the factory is silent. The forges are cold. The gates are locked. In March 2024, the last workers walked out of the Ilion plant for the final time, ending 2 centuries of continuous production. The equipment was loaded onto trucks and shipped to Georgia. The buildings stand empty, 1 million square feet of brick and memory slowly surrendering to rust and weeds. Remington did not die because Americans stopped buying guns. They died because private equity discovered there was more money in stripping a company for parts than in actually making things. They died because management chose short-term profit over long-term survival. They died because the same rifles that built their reputation were also the rifles that destroyed it. This is the story of how America's oldest gunmaker rose to arm the world, fell to corporate raiders, and left behind a haunted factory and a town that may never recover. Was the collapse inevitable? The natural death of an industry that no longer fit the modern economy? Or was it a preventable tragedy engineered by men who never pulled a trigger but knew exactly how to pull apart a balance sheet? The answer lies in 200 years of fire and steel, of ambition and catastrophe, of workers who gave their bodies to the forge and executives who gave nothing back. The story begins with a single rifle barrel. In 1816, a 23-year-old blacksmith named Eliphalet Remington stood at his father's forge in Litchfield, New York, a small settlement in the Mohawk Valley. He wanted a rifle. He could not afford to buy one, so he decided to make one himself. Working the iron over hot coals, hammering it flat, wrapping it around a mandrel, welding the seam with fire and force, he produced a barrel unlike anything available commercially. The steel was denser, the bore was straighter. When he took it to a local gunsmith in Utica to have it rifled and fitted to a stock, the result was a weapon of unusual accuracy. Remington entered a shooting match that same year. He finished second place, but the men who finished below him were more interested in his rifle than in his marksmanship. Before he left the field, he had taken orders for more barrels than he could produce in a month. The business that would become Remington Arms was born not from a marketing plan or an investor pitch, but from a young man's refusal to accept that he could not have what he wanted. For the next decade, Eliphalet Remington made only barrels. He sold them to gunsmiths who assembled complete weapons. Content to remain a specialist in a market that barely existed, his reputation grew steadily through the 1820s. Hunters throughout the Mohawk Valley learned that a Remington barrel shot straighter and lasted longer than anything else available. The word spread from hunting camps to general stores, from taverns to trading posts. Men who cared about accuracy came to Litchfield to place orders. But Eliphalet was constrained by geography. His father's forge was located away from the main transportation routes. Every barrel he produced had to be hauled overland to reach customers. The process was slow, expensive, and limiting. He needed access to water, not just for power, but for transport. In 1828, opportunity forced expansion. The Erie Canal had opened 3 years earlier, transforming the economy of upstate New York. What had been isolated farming communities were suddenly connected to the markets of Albany and New York City. Goods could flow. Labor could concentrate. Industry could scale. The canal had created a corridor of commerce through the Mohawk Valley. Remington understood what the canal meant. He purchased 100 acres of land along the waterway in a settlement called Morgan's Landing, approximately 80 miles west of Albany. The location was strategic. The canal provided transportation to eastern markets. The Mohawk River and its tributaries provided water power for machinery. The surrounding forests provided charcoal for fuel. The region's iron deposits provided raw material. He built a forge. He constructed a dam across Steele's Creek to power his machinery. He installed the water-driven equipment that would allow him to increase production beyond anything a single blacksmith could achieve by hand. The investment represented everything Remington had accumulated over a dozen years of barrel making and everything he could borrow. The gamble paid off. By the mid-1830s, Remington was producing complete rifles for the first time, controlling every stage of manufacture from the barrel to the stock to the lock mechanism. His workforce grew from a handful of apprentices to dozens of skilled craftsmen. The settlement grew around the factory. Streets were laid, homes were built, churches went up. A general store opened to serve the workers. A boarding house provided lodging for new arrivals. By 1843, the community had grown large enough to warrant its own post office. By 1852, it had grown large enough to incorporate as a village. They named it Ilion, after the ancient Greek name for Troy. It was a small joke with large implications. Troy had fallen. Ilion was just beginning. The factory dominated the village physically and economically. Main Street ran directly through the Remington property, with manufacturing buildings on both sides. Workers lived within walking distance of the plant. Their children attended schools built by the company. Their families shopped at stores that depended on Remington wages. The distinction between the town and the factory was theoretical at best. In practice, they were the same thing. The first government contract came in 1845. The United States Army needed rifles for the coming war with Mexico. A manufacturer named John Griffith of Cincinnati had won a contract for 5,000 Model 1841 percussion rifles, the famous Mississippi rifles, that would prove themselves in the deserts of northern Mexico. But Griffith defaulted. He could not deliver. The Ordnance Department needed a replacement, and they found one in the Mohawk Valley. Eliphalet Remington delivered the rifles on time and under budget. The quality exceeded specifications. The Army was impressed. More contracts followed. By the mid-1850s, Remington had produced more than 20,000 Model 1841 rifles for the federal government. The company had proven it could manufacture at scale. It had proven it could meet military requirements. It had proven it could be trusted. Then the Civil War began, and Remington discovered what real scale actually looked like. The war between the states created a demand for weapons that no American manufacturer had ever imagined. The Union Army alone would eventually field more than 2 million soldiers. Every one of them needed a rifle. Every one of them needed a sidearm. Every one of them needed ammunition. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the government's primary arsenal, could not come close to meeting demand. Private manufacturers were called upon to fill the gap. Remington responded. Eliphalet had died in August 1861, just months after the war began, but his sons, Philo, Samuel, and Eliphalet III, had already taken control of the business. They understood what the war represented, an opportunity to transform a regional manufacturer into a national one. They expanded the factory immediately, adding new buildings and new production lines, before they had even secured contracts to justify the investment. The gamble was enormous. Iron and steel were expensive. Skilled labor was scarce. Many potential workers had enlisted. Machine tools had to be ordered months in advance. Every dollar invested was a dollar that might never return if the war ended quickly or if contracts went to competitors. But the gamble paid off. The War Department needed everything Remington could produce, and more. Contracts accumulated. The factory expanded again. They hired workers by the hundreds, training new hands in skills that normally took years to acquire. Women entered the workforce for the first time, performing tasks that had previously been reserved for men. They added production lines for revolvers, a market they had only entered 4 years earlier. The Remington Beals revolver, designed by company employee Fordyce Beals, had been introduced in 1857 as a pocket pistol. Now the design was scaled up for military use. The new model Army revolver, chambered in Beisha-Fi-C, Dod-Besi 44 caliber, proved to be a formidable weapon, arguably superior to the Colt revolvers that dominated the market. The Remington's advantage was structural. Where Colt used an open-top frame design, the Remington featured a solid top strap connecting the barrel to the grip. This made the gun stronger and more resistant to the frame stretching that plagued heavily used Colts. It also made the gun more accurate, since the barrel and cylinder remained in consistent alignment. By the war's end, Remington had produced more than 115,000 44 caliber Army revolvers and more than 12,000 36 caliber Navy revolvers for the federal government alone. Combined with their rifle production, which included the famous WWII rifle and various contract muskets, they had manufactured approximately 250,000 weapons for the Union cause. The total rivaled only Colt. The Remington revolver became the second most used sidearm of the Civil War. It rode with cavalry units at Brandy Station, where Union and Confederate horsemen clashed in the largest cavalry engagement of the war. It was carried by infantry regiments at Gettysburg, where the fate of the nation hung in the balance for 3 bloody July days. When Colt's factory burned in 1864, temporarily halting production of their famous 1860 Army model, the government turned almost exclusively to Remington to fill the gap. The Ilion factory ran at maximum capacity. Workers put in 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. The forges never cooled. The war made Remington wealthy. It made Ilion prosperous. It established the company as a manufacturer of the first rank, capable of producing precision weapons in quantities that rivaled government arsenals. But wars end, contracts expire, and companies that expand to meet wartime demand must somehow survive the peace. The decade following the Civil War nearly destroyed Remington. Military orders evaporated. The civilian market, flooded with surplus government weapons, could not absorb new production. The company diversified desperately, adding sewing machines in 1870 and typewriters in 1873. The Remington typewriter, using the now ubiquitous QWERTY keyboard layout, would eventually become a separate company and a commercial success. But in the 1870s, it was merely another product line in a company struggling to find its footing. What saved Remington was not the American market, it was the world. In 1866, the company had begun producing a new rifle design that would become one of the most successful firearms of the 19th century, the rolling block. Patented by Remington engineers Joseph Ryder and Leonard Geiger, the rolling block used a simple, strong, and elegant breech-loading mechanism. A hammer and breech block rotated on the same axis, each locking the other in place when the weapon was cocked. The design was virtually indestructible. It could handle the higher pressures of metallic cartridges, it could be manufactured cheaply and maintained easily, and it could be chambered in almost any caliber a customer wanted. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. When the shooter cocked the hammer, it rotated backward, allowing the breech block to pivot down and expose the chamber. A cartridge could then be inserted. When the breech block was closed and the hammer fell, the two pieces interlocked with such strength that the action could withstand pressures far exceeding those of contemporary designs. Field repairs were simple. Parts were interchangeable. A soldier could strip and reassemble the rifle in minutes. The rolling block became Remington's ticket to global dominance. Between 1867 and 1900, the company and its licensees produced millions of these rifles for military customers on every inhabited continent. The sales campaign was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. Denmark was the first major customer, ordering 42,000 rifles and 1,800 carbines in 1867. The Danes had evaluated multiple breech-loading designs and concluded that the Remington was the most reliable and cost-effective option. Their endorsement opened doors throughout Europe. Sweden and Norway followed immediately. The two kingdoms, then united under a single crown, adopted the rolling block as their standard service rifle in November 1867. They initially purchased rifles directly from Remington, then negotiated licenses to manufacture the design domestically. Over the following decades, Swedish and Norwegian factories produced more than 300,000 rolling block rifles and carbines under license. Spain armed its entire military with the rolling block from 1869 to 1893. The Spanish contract was one of Remington's largest and most lucrative. Over 1.5 million rifles in 43 Spanish caliber were eventually produced, making the Spanish model the most common variant of the rolling block worldwide. Egypt purchased hundreds of thousands of rifles, using them to equip the army that would fight at the Battle of Tel el-Kabir and defend Khartoum against the Mahdist forces. The Egyptian contract had an unexpected consequence. When France found itself desperately short of rifles during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, 100,000 Egyptian contract rolling blocks were diverted to French forces. France alone purchased 210,000 rolling blocks in a single desperate order, trying to replace the Chassepot rifles they were losing to Prussian needle guns. The contract was negotiated and fulfilled in a matter of months, a feat of manufacturing that demonstrated Remington's capacity to respond to urgent demand. Argentina, Mexico, Belgium, the Papal States The list of customers read like a roster of 19th-century nations. Even the Vatican purchased rolling blocks to arm its guards. The rifle was carried by soldiers on 5 continents, fought in dozens of conflicts, and remained in service with some armies into the 20th century. The money flowed. The factory expanded. By the 1880s, Remington employed thousands of workers in Ilion. The company had become the town. The town had become the company. 3 generations of families worked the same production lines. Sons learned the trade from fathers who had learned it from grandfathers. The skills required to produce precision firearms, the machining, the fitting, the finishing, were passed down like heirlooms. The relationship between company and community was both paternalistic and practical. Remington provided steady employment at wages above the regional average. Workers provided loyalty and skill that could not be replicated overnight. The arrangement was not equal. Management retained all decision-making authority, but it was stable. Both sides understood what they were getting. But the global arms market was fickle. New designs emerged. Competitors undercut prices. The bolt-action repeating rifle made the single-shot rolling block obsolete almost overnight. The Mauser action, with its internal magazine and smooth operation, became the new standard for military rifles. Nations that had purchased rolling blocks in the 1870s were already replacing them with repeaters by the 1890s. And Remington, still family-owned, had expanded faster than its capital base could support. The diversification into typewriters and sewing machines had consumed resources. The international sales network required constant investment. Debts accumulated. Creditors grew impatient. In 1886, E. Remington and Sons entered receivership. The company that had armed the Union, equipped half the armies of Europe, and pioneered the modern typewriter was bankrupt. The Remington family, which had controlled the business for 70 years, lost everything. 2 years later, in March 1888, new owners stepped in. Marcellus Hartley, a partner in the New York sporting goods firm of Hartley and Graham, joined with Winchester Repeating Arms to purchase the company. Each partner held an equal share. The name was formally changed to Remington Arms Company. The typewriter business, which had been spun off before the bankruptcy, went its separate way. What remained was guns and ammunition. For the next 2 decades, Remington operated as a respectable but unremarkable sporting arms manufacturer. Military contracts were few. The company produced hunting rifles and double-barreled shotguns for the growing American leisure market. But it was no longer a giant. It was a survivor. Then, in 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and the world began to tear itself apart. The First World War created demand on a scale that made the Civil War look like a skirmish. The armies of Europe had entered the conflict expecting a quick, decisive campaign. Instead, they found themselves locked in a war of attrition that consumed men and material faster than any conflict in history. Machine guns mowed down infantry by the thousands. Artillery barrages lasted for days. Poison gas drifted across trenches. And rifles, bolt-action repeating rifles that required skilled manufacturing to produce, were expended at rates no one had anticipated. The mathematics of industrial warfare were staggering. A single infantry division required approximately 15,000 rifles. The belligerent powers had mobilized hundreds of divisions. Rifles were lost in combat, captured by enemies, damaged beyond repair, buried with their owners in the mud of Flanders. The factories of Europe ran at maximum capacity and still could not keep pace with consumption. Britain needed rifles. France needed rifles. Russia needed rifles. Their own factories could not keep up. They turned to America. Remington received its first major contract in 1914, when Britain ordered Pattern 14 rifles chambered in .303 British. The order was enormous. Millions of rifles to be delivered as fast as possible. But Remington's Ilion factory, designed for civilian production, could not handle the volume. The company needed to expand immediately. Enter Marcellus Hartley Dodge. Dodge had inherited control of Remington from his grandfather, the original Marcellus Hartley. He was 34 years old in 1915, wealthy beyond measure, and determined to make Remington the arsenal of democracy before America even entered the war. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, torpedoed by a German submarine while carrying tons of Remington ammunition, had convinced Dodge that American involvement was inevitable. He intended to be ready. Using his family's connection to the Union Metallic Cartridge Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which Hartley and Graham had also owned, Dodge orchestrated a merger that created a single integrated weapons and ammunition manufacturer. Remington UMC was born. The combination created a company capable of producing not just rifles, but also the cartridges to feed them. The expansion that followed was breathtaking. In Bridgeport, Remington constructed an entirely new factory complex in less than a year. 38 buildings spread across 73 acres. 1.5 million square feet of manufacturing space under a single interconnected roof. 13 five-story buildings numbered 22 through 34, connected by covered walkways that allowed workers and materials to move between structures without exposure to weather. A private army of 300 former soldiers to guard the property against sabotage, a genuine concern given German intelligence operations in the United States. A workforce that grew from a few hundred to more than 17,000 in 18 months. The construction itself was a feat of industrial organization. Foundations were poured while architectural drawings were still being completed. Machinery was ordered before buildings existed to house it. Workers were recruited before training programs had been established. The entire project embodied the controlled chaos of wartime production. A line of men stood outside the Remington Arms Company every day, waiting to be hired. According to contemporary accounts, the company added a new worker every 20 minutes. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe seeking work in the booming munitions industry. African Americans from the rural South participating in the Great Migration that would reshape American demographics. Women entering factory work in numbers never before seen. By April 1916, 16,000 men and women were employed at the Bridgeport facility alone. By the time America entered the war in 1917, the number had swelled past 20,000. The factory operated around the clock, 3 shifts cycling through the buildings in endless rotation. At peak production, 10,000 rifles rolled off the lines every single day. 1 rifle every 8 seconds. Every minute, 7 new weapons capable of killing at 1,000 yards. The New York Times called it the greatest small arms and ammunition plant in the world. It was not hyperbole. But the contracts came with complications. Russia had ordered 1 million Mosin Nagant rifles and 100 million rounds of ammunition. French contracts required pattern 1914 rifles in 8 mm level. British contracts demanded 303 caliber weapons. Each customer wanted rifles built to their own specifications, in their own calibers, meeting their own inspection standards. The Ilion factory expanded as well. New buildings rose. New machinery was installed. The company built its own boats to transport materials on the Erie Canal. It constructed worker housing to accommodate the influx of new employees. The town of Ilion doubled in population. Then the Russian Revolution happened. In 1917, the Tsar was overthrown. The provisional government that replaced him was itself replaced by the Bolsheviks. The new Soviet regime repudiated all debts and contracts of the former government. Remington was left holding millions of dollars in unpaid invoices and warehouses full of rifles that no longer had a buyer. When America finally entered the war, the government stepped in. The U.S. Army needed rifles desperately. The Springfield Armory could not produce enough M1903 Springfields to equip the rapidly expanding military. Remington proposed a solution. The British pattern 14 rifles they had been producing could be modified to accept American .36 ammunition. The resulting weapon, designated the U.S. Rifle Model 1917, became the standard infantry rifle of the American Expeditionary Forces. By December 1917, the Ilion plant alone was producing 3,000 Model 1917 rifles per day. By the end of the war, Remington had manufactured nearly 70% of all rifles used by the American military, and more than 50% of all small arms ammunition used by the United States and its allies. The company had become indispensable. It had proven that American industry could outproduce any enemy. And then, once again, the war ended, and Remington discovered that peacetime was far more dangerous than combat. The 1920s began with hope and ended in catastrophe. Remington had diversified during the war, producing cash registers and other mechanical devices. Sales were strong through most of the decade. But the Great Depression devastated the sporting arms market. Hunting was a luxury. Ammunition was an expense. By 1932, the Ilion factory employed only 300 workers, down from thousands just a decade earlier. Remington needed a lifeline. It found one in Delaware. E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, DuPont, had made its fortune in gunpowder. The company had supplied explosives to the American military since the War of 1812. It had expanded into chemicals, plastics, and synthetic materials. By the 1930s, DuPont was one of the largest and most diversified industrial conglomerates in the world, and it saw opportunity in Remington's distress. In May 1933, DuPont purchased a 60% stake in Remington Arms. The investment brought immediate improvements. Old buildings were torn down, facilities were modernized, product lines were consolidated. Within a few years, Remington had regained its footing as a premium sporting arms manufacturer. Then, the world went to war again. The Second World War demanded even more from American industry than the first. The scope of the conflict was global. The technology was more advanced. The logistics were more complex, and the American military, which had demobilized almost completely after 1918, needed to be rebuilt from scratch. DuPont and Remington were ready. They had learned from the First War. They understood how to scale production quickly. They knew how to work with government bureaucracies. They had maintained the engineering expertise and manufacturing knowledge that would be essential for wartime production. The first step was ammunition. In 1940, the United States Army became concerned about its ammunition manufacturing capacity. The country had only a handful of facilities capable of producing military cartridges in quantity. If America entered the war, the existing capacity would be woefully inadequate. The Army asked Remington to collaborate on a plan for national expansion. The concept was straightforward. The government would build and own the factories, while private contractors would operate them. This government-owned, contractor-operated model, GOCO, would become the standard for American munitions production throughout the war and beyond. Together with DuPont, Remington surveyed 51 potential sites for new ammunition plants. They evaluated water supplies, transportation links, labor availability, and distance from potential enemy attack. In September 1940, the Army asked Remington to establish and operate the first facility. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant rose from farmland outside Independence, Missouri. Construction began in December 1940. Production began in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. The facility would become the single largest producer of small arms ammunition for the United States Armed Forces, a position it maintains to this day. Remington built and operated 4 additional ammunition plants during the war: Denver Ordnance in Colorado, facilities in Salt Lake City and Kings Mill, and the Lowell Ordnance Plant in Massachusetts. The plants belonged to the government, but Remington ran them under fixed-fee contracts, responsible for everything from construction advice to quality control to workforce management. At Ilion, the factory returned to military production with familiar intensity. The M1903A3 Springfield rifle, a simplified version of the famous bolt-action rifle that had served American soldiers since 1903, rolled off the lines by the tens of thousands. The original M1903 required extensive machining operations that were time-consuming and expensive. The A3 variant replaced milled parts with stamped components wherever possible, reducing production time without sacrificing reliability. The M1903A4 sniper rifle followed, essentially an A3 fitted with a telescopic sight and modified stock. Remington also produced the M1911A1 pistol, the standard American service sidearm. They manufactured the Browning Model 1917 heavy machine gun, a water-cooled weapon that provided sustained fire for infantry units. The workforce at Ilion swelled to levels not seen since the First War. Women returned to the factory floor in large numbers, replacing men who had enlisted or been drafted. Training programs accelerated, compressing years of apprenticeship into months of intensive instruction. Quality standards remained high despite the pressure. By the war's end, Remington had once again proven itself essential to American victory. The company had manufactured hundreds of thousands of military firearms. It had operated 5 ammunition plants that produced billions of rounds. But something had changed. The age of the small arms manufacturer as a strategic national asset was ending. Atomic weapons had redefined warfare. The bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated that future conflicts might be decided not by millions of soldiers with rifles, but by a handful of aircraft carrying nuclear payloads. Guided missiles and jet aircraft were becoming the weapons of the future. The infantry rifle, while still essential for ground combat, was no longer the centerpiece of military strategy. The contracts that had sustained Remington through 2 world wars would not return at the same scale. The government's appetite for millions of rifles had been satisfied. The ammunition plants would continue operating, but at reduced capacity. The boom times were over. The company adapted. It focused on the civilian market. And in 1950, it introduced the product that would define Remington for the next half-century: the Model 870 pump-action shotgun. The 870 was not revolutionary, it was refined. Remington engineer L. Ray Crittenden and his team had studied every pump-action shotgun on the market, identifying strengths and weaknesses in each design. They knew that reliability was paramount. A pump shotgun that jammed in the field, whether while hunting waterfowl or defending a home, was worse than useless. It had to function perfectly every time, regardless of conditions. They designed a receiver machined from a solid billet of steel rather than assembled from stamped parts like some competitors. They created a twin-action bar system, that prevented the binding and jamming that could occur when a single action bar twisted under stress. They engineered a trigger mechanism that provided a crisp, consistent pull. They selected dimensions that balanced handling characteristics against recoil management. The result was a shotgun that hunters could trust absolutely. It handled the recoil of heavy magnum loads without complaint. It cycled smoothly in temperatures from Arctic cold to desert heat. It could be field stripped and reassembled by anyone with basic mechanical aptitude. It accepted a wide variety of barrels, allowing owners to configure the same receiver for bird hunting, deer hunting, or home defense simply by swapping components. The price point was aggressive. Remington positioned the 870 as a premium shotgun available to middle-class buyers, not a luxury item reserved for wealthy sportsmen. The strategy worked. Sales exceeded projections from the first year. Remington sold more than 11 million Model 870s over the following decades, making it the best-selling pump-action shotgun in history. Police departments across America adopted it as their standard long gun. The distinctive sound of an 870 action being cycled became synonymous with law enforcement presence. Hunters carried it into marshes and cornfields every autumn. Competitive shooters used it to break clay targets. Home defenders kept it loaded beside their beds. The design became a template that other manufacturers copied, a standard against which all pump shotguns were measured. 12 years later, Remington introduced another iconic firearm, the Model 700 bolt-action rifle. The development of the Model 700 represented the culmination of engineering work that had begun shortly after World War II. Remington engineer Merle Mike Walker had been tasked with designing a rifle that could be manufactured efficiently while maintaining the accuracy that serious shooters demanded. The challenge was substantial. Precision rifles had traditionally required extensive hand-fitting, with skilled gunsmiths spending hours adjusting each weapon to meet specifications. Walker needed to achieve the same results through standardized processes. His solution was elegant. The 700 used a cylindrical receiver machined from bar stock on a lathe. This was simpler and faster than the milling operations required for traditional receiver designs. Small metal parts were stamped rather than machined. Stocks were finished to a practical standard rather than hand-rubbed to a mirror shine. Every element of the design prioritized manufacturability without sacrificing accuracy. The trigger mechanism was the key innovation. Traditional rifle triggers required extensive hand-fitting to achieve a clean, crisp pull, the kind of pull that allowed a shooter to release the shot without disturbing the rifle's aim. Walker created a mechanism using a small piece called a trigger connector that, at least in theory, provided excellent performance without requiring individual adjustment. The Model 700 was introduced in 1962 in two variants, the ADL with a blind magazine and the BDL with a hinged floor plate that allowed easy unloading. Both were available in multiple calibers, from the mild .222 Remington to the powerful .375 H&H Magnum. The rifles proved immediately popular with hunters who appreciated their accuracy, their smooth bolt operation, and their reasonable price. The U.S. Army noticed. In 1988, the military adopted a variant of the Model 700 as the M24 sniper weapon system, replacing the M21 that had served since Vietnam. The selection validated everything Walker and his team had designed. The Marine Corps selected a similar variant, designated the M40. Law enforcement agencies across the country purchased Model 700s for their tactical teams. Remington sold millions of Model 700s over the following decades. It became the company's flagship rifle. Third-party manufacturers built entire businesses around aftermarket components for the Model 700 action. But the Walker trigger mechanism, the very feature that made the Model 700 economical to produce, contained a design flaw that would haunt the company for decades. The problem was the trigger connector itself. In Walker's design, the connector was mounted loosely inside the firing mechanism, held in place by a small spring, rather than being rigidly attached to the trigger body. This resilient mounting was essential to the mechanism's function. The connector needed to move precisely during the firing sequence, but it also created vulnerability. Under normal operation, the connector functioned flawlessly. The mechanism provided the crisp, consistent pull that made the Model 700 famous. But if debris accumulated inside the trigger housing, dirt, dust, dried lubricant, particles of burnt powder, the connector could fail to seat properly against the trigger. If the internal parts became slightly misaligned due to wear or manufacturing variation, the relationship between connector and sear could change. If the safety was engaged and disengaged quickly, the connector might not return to its correct position. When any of these things happened, the rifle could fire without the trigger being pulled. The sear would release, the firing pin would fall, the cartridge would discharge, and whoever was holding the rifle or standing in front of it would have no warning and no defense. The failure mode was particularly insidious because it was intermittent. A rifle might function perfectly for years, then discharge unexpectedly, then function perfectly again for years more. The unpredictability made the problem difficult to diagnose and nearly impossible to predict. Remington knew about the problem almost from the beginning. Internal documents dating to 1948, before the Model 700 was even introduced, when Walker was still developing the trigger mechanism for the earlier Model 721, showed that Walker himself had identified the risk. A memo from that year described a theoretical unsafe condition involving the gun's safety. Subsequent inspection reports during the testing process noted guns that could be made to fire simply by switching off the safety or operating the bolt. One 1947 report warned that the situation was very dangerous from a safety and functional point of view. Walker proposed a design change to eliminate the risk. He designed a trigger block, a mechanism that would force the trigger and connector into proper alignment whenever the safety was engaged. The modification was straightforward. Walker calculated that the tooling and equipment changes would cost approximately $21,000. The per-rifle cost increase would be about 5.5 cents. Management rejected the proposal. The Model 721 was already over budget. The risk seemed theoretical, a laboratory finding that might never manifest in the field. The potential liability seemed remote. In 1948, product liability law barely existed. Class action lawsuits were rare. The trigger block was never implemented. More than 5 million rifles were eventually manufactured with the design that Walker himself had identified as potentially dangerous. Over the following decades, thousands of complaints accumulated. Hunters reported rifles discharging when the safety was released. Families reported loved ones killed or maimed by weapons that fired without warning. Lawsuits accumulated. Remington settled them quietly, one by one, without admitting fault. The company insisted that every incident was the result of user error. In October 2010, CNBC broadcast a documentary titled Remington Under Fire. The investigation revealed internal documents showing that Remington had twice considered recalling the Model 700, once in 1970 and again in 1994. Both times, management had rejected the idea. The cost was too high. The admission would be too damaging. The documentary estimated that at least 24 deaths and more than 100 injuries had been linked to the defective trigger mechanism. More than 75 lawsuits had been filed, and more than 5 million rifles with the Walker trigger remained in circulation. Merle Walker, the engineer who had designed the trigger mechanism 62 years earlier, was interviewed for the documentary. He was 98 years old. He confirmed that he had proposed a safer alternative in 1948. He believed the company had rejected it because of cost. 5.5 cents per rifle. The cost of lives lost, the mathematics of American manufacturing. Remington did not recall the rifles. Instead, the company attacked the documentary. It denied that the guns were defective. It blamed consumers. Eventually, in 2014, a class action lawsuit forced Remington to offer free trigger replacements on approximately 7.5 million rifles. The settlement allowed Remington to maintain that the guns were safe, while simultaneously agreeing to replace the mechanism that made them unsafe. By 2017, only 22,000 gun owners had filed claims. Millions of rifles with the Walker trigger remained in circulation. The trigger scandal was damaging, but it was not fatal. What killed Remington was something far more modern: private equity. In 1993, DuPont had sold Remington to the investment firm Clayton, Dubilier & Rice for approximately $300 million. The sale reflected changes in both companies. DuPont was refocusing on chemicals and materials science. The firearms market had softened as American interest in hunting declined. Long guns, rifles, and shotguns, which represented 75% of Remington's sales, were no longer growing. Clayton, Dubilier & Rice operated Remington for 14 years. The company remained profitable, if unspectacular. Product development continued. The Ilion factory kept running. Then, in June 2007, Cerberus Capital Management entered the picture. Cerberus was a private equity firm named after the three-headed dog that guards the gates of hell in Greek mythology. The name was meant to convey vigilance and protection. In practice, Cerberus was known for aggressive financial engineering, acquiring underperforming companies, loading them with debt, cutting costs, and either selling them for a profit or stripping them for parts. The private equity model was straightforward in principle and devastating in practice. A firm like Cerberus would identify a company with valuable assets, brand names, real estate, established customer relationships, that was underperforming financially. They would purchase the company using a relatively small amount of their own capital and a large amount of borrowed money. The debt would be placed on the acquired company's balance sheet, not the private equity firms. Then, the extraction would begin. Management fees, transaction fees, monitoring fees. The private equity firm would charge the acquired company for the privilege of being owned. Assets would be sold. Real estate would be monetized through sale-leaseback arrangements. Pension obligations would be terminated or transferred. Costs would be cut, often by eliminating workers, closing facilities, or reducing investment in product development. If the strategy worked, the private equity firm would sell the company after a few years for more than they paid, pocketing the difference plus all the fees. If the strategy failed, the private equity firm would still have extracted fees and potentially transferred valuable assets to related entities. The company might go bankrupt, but the investors would be protected. The workers and communities would bear the losses. Cerberus paid $370 million for Remington, including $252 million in assumed debt. The company had not reported a profit from 2003 to 2005. Cerberus believed it could turn things around. The acquisition created a new entity called the Freedom Group, a holding company that would eventually include not just Remington, but also Bushmaster, DPMS, Marlin Firearms, and several other gun manufacturers. The strategy was consolidation, create a firearms conglomerate that could dominate the American market through scale, reducing costs by combining administrative functions and leveraging purchasing power. For a few years, the strategy appeared to work. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 triggered what gun industry analysts called the Obama surge, a massive increase in firearms sales driven by consumer fears that the new administration would impose restrictions on gun ownership. Every time the president mentioned gun control, sales spiked. Every time a mass shooting made headlines, sales spiked. Fear was good for business. Remington's sales jumped. The Model 870 and Model 700 flew off shelves. Ammunition was perpetually backordered. The company struggled to produce enough to meet demand. But beneath the sales numbers, problems were accumulating. The debt burden was crushing. The trigger lawsuits continued. The Freedom Group's other acquisitions, particularly Marlin Firearms, were struggling with quality control issues after being integrated into the conglomerate. The aggressive marketing of tactical weapons, particularly AR-15-style rifles, was generating controversy. Then came December 14, 2012. At approximately 9:35 in the morning, a 20-year-old man named Adam Lanza forced his way into Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. He had killed his mother at their home that morning and taken weapons from her collection. One of those weapons was a Bushmaster XM15 E2S rifle, a semi-automatic weapon chambered in .223 Remington, manufactured by a company that Cerberus had acquired through the Freedom Group. In the next 11 minutes, Lanza killed 20 children, all of them first graders, 6 and 7 years old, and 6 adult staff members. He then killed himself as police closed in. It was the deadliest mass shooting at an elementary school in American history. The massacre changed everything. Public outrage over Sandy Hook was different from the response to previous mass shootings. The victims were children, small children, first graders with their whole lives ahead of them. The images of grieving parents, of teddy bears and flowers, left at makeshift memorials, of a community shattered. These images penetrated the national consciousness in a way that previous tragedies had not. Political pressure for gun control reached levels not seen in decades. President Obama made gun legislation a priority. Polls showed majority support for expanded background checks and restrictions on assault-style weapons. The legislation failed in Congress, but the moment had created consequences that would follow Remington for years. Cerberus faced immediate pressure from its own investors. Many of the pension funds and institutional investors that had committed capital to Cerberus were appalled to discover that their money had been used to acquire companies that manufactured weapons like the one used at Sandy Hook. They demanded action. Cerberus announced that it would sell its stake in the Freedom Group, citing what it called a national tragedy. No buyers emerged. The political toxicity of the firearms industry was too intense. Institutional investors who might have purchased the Freedom Group did not want the reputational risk. Cerberus was stuck with the companies it had assembled. The families of 9 Sandy Hook victims filed a lawsuit against Remington in 2015. They argued that the company, through its Bushmaster subsidiary, had marketed the rifle used in the massacre in ways that violated Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act. The lawsuit claimed that Remington had targeted young men with advertising that glorified violence and military-style combat. The legal theory was novel. Normally, firearms manufacturers were protected from lawsuits arising from criminal use of their products by the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, a federal law enacted in 2005. The gun industry had specifically sought and obtained this protection, but the family's attorneys found a loophole. PLCAA contained exceptions for certain violations of state law, including laws governing marketing and sales practices. Connecticut's Unfair Trade Practices Act prohibited businesses from engaging in deceptive or unethical marketing. If Remington's marketing violated this state law, the federal immunity might not apply. The case wound through the courts for years. In 2019, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that the lawsuit could proceed. Remington appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The court declined to hear the case, allowing the Connecticut ruling to stand. Meanwhile, Remington's financial situation was deteriorating. The Obama surge had reversed. Debt had accumulated. In March 2018, Remington filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with more than $950 million in debt. Cerberus lost its ownership stake. In July 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic swept across America and gun sales surged to record levels, Remington filed for bankruptcy again. This time, there would be no reorganization. The company was broken into pieces and sold at auction. The Sandy Hook lawsuit continued through both bankruptcies. In February 2022, the families reached a settlement. Remington's insurers agreed to pay $73 million, the largest settlement ever paid by a gun company in connection with a mass shooting. The settlement required the release of thousands of pages of internal documents showing how Remington and its parent companies had marketed AR-15-style rifles. The families had achieved something gun control advocates had sought for decades: accountability. Remarms, the company that purchased the Ilion factory out of bankruptcy, promised to continue Remington's legacy. In November 2021, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp announced that the company would relocate its headquarters to LaGrange, Georgia. But Remarms also promised to keep the Ilion factory open, claiming it would increase production and add employees. Ilion Mayor John Stevens believed them. The workers believed them. They were wrong. On December 1, 2023, Remarms informed union officials that the Ilion plant would close the following March. All manufacturing would relocate to Georgia. The announcement came just weeks before Christmas, 2 years after the company had promised to expand operations in New York. On March 4, 2024, the Remington factory in Ilion, New York, ceased operations. The last workers clocked out. The machines fell silent. 207 years of continuous firearms manufacturing in the Mohawk Valley ended. The buildings remain. 1 million square feet of brick and concrete and memory. 42 structures, 22 of which were built between 1914 and 1916, when the factory expanded to arm the Allies in World War I. The complex sits on 34 acres in the center of a town that exists because the factory existed. Remarms still owns the property. The company is responsible for maintaining the buildings and paying property taxes, but no one knows what will happen to the site. The structures are too old and too contaminated to convert easily. The town lacks the resources to acquire and redevelop them. The state has offered little assistance. Some speak of turning the factory into a museum or a mixed-use development. Others fear it will simply decay, joining the abandoned mills and shuttered plants that dot the American landscape, monuments to industries that once built the nation and then disappeared. The shot tower in Bridgeport still stands. That 10-story structure, 190 feet tall, where workers once poured molten lead through sieves and let it fall into water to form perfect spheres. It survives as the last remnant of Remington's Connecticut operations. The factory around it has been demolished. The land has been cleared, but the tower remains, too expensive to tear down, too contaminated to repurpose, a tombstone for an industry that died there in 1988. The Ilion factory may follow the same trajectory, a hulking presence that no one can afford to remove. A reminder of what was lost. Ilion's population peaked at around 8,000 in the mid-20th century. By 2020, it had fallen to approximately 7,600. The closure of the Remington plant will accelerate the decline. Young people will leave for opportunities elsewhere. Businesses that served factory workers will close. The tax base will erode. The cycle of deindustrialization that has hollowed out communities across the American heartland will continue. Mayor Stevens has tried to remain optimistic. He has suggested that the factory's historical significance might attract developers or preserve at least part of the site. He has noted that the financial impact on the village may be less severe than feared, since Remarms will continue paying property taxes. But the loss is more than financial. The loss is identity. Ilion was Remington. Remington was Ilion. The company did not just employ workers. It created the town, sustained the town, defined the town for 2 centuries. Without Remington, Ilion must become something else. What that something else might be, no one can say. The workers who lost their jobs face uncertain futures. Some may find positions at other manufacturers in the region. Some may retire early, drawing on pensions that may or may not survive Remington's repeated bankruptcies. Some will leave for other states, following the jobs that have migrated south and west. And some will simply fall through the cracks, too old to retrain, too young to retire, too rooted to relocate. This is the human cost of private equity. This is what happens when companies become assets to be traded rather than institutions to be sustained. Cerberus did not buy Remington to manufacture firearms. Cerberus bought Remington to generate returns for investors. When the returns did not materialize, Cerberus walked away. Rem Arms repeated the pattern, collecting tax incentives from Georgia while making commitments to New York it did not keep. The CEO cited the cost of operating old buildings and New York's legislative environment. He did not cite the promises made 2 years earlier. He did not acknowledge the workers who had kept the company alive through bankruptcy, who had returned to the factory when production resumed, who had believed their dedication would be rewarded. Their dedication was not rewarded. Their skills were not valued. Their community was not considered. They were numbers on a spreadsheet. 207 years of American manufacturing history reduced to an asset sale. The company that armed the Union at Gettysburg, that equipped the Allies in 2 world wars, that built the most popular shotgun and one of the most popular rifles in American history, that company no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The Remington name survives. Vista Outdoor puts it on ammunition boxes. Rem Arms puts it on rifles assembled in Georgia. But the continuity is legal fiction. The workers who made Remington what it was, who possessed the skills and knowledge accumulated over generations, are gone. The decline of Remington was not the decline of those skills. The workers in Ilion remained capable of producing the finest firearms in the world until the day the factory closed. The Model 870 that rolled off the line in 2023 was as reliable as the one produced in 1953. The Model 700 maintained its accuracy through 7 decades of continuous production. The workers did not fail. The company failed them. The mathematics of private equity do not account for skill. They do not measure pride. They do not calculate the value of a workforce that has spent generations perfecting a craft. The equations recognize only debt and equity, revenue and cost, assets and liabilities. Workers are costs. Communities are externalities. Heritage is branding. Under these equations, it made sense to close the Ilion plant. The buildings were old and expensive to maintain. The New York regulatory environment was hostile to firearms manufacturers. Labor costs in Georgia would be lower. The decision maximized shareholder value, or at least it was projected to do so. But the equations missed something. They missed the fact that the workers in Ilion possessed knowledge that could not be transferred on a spreadsheet. They missed the fact that skills developed over generations cannot be recreated in months. They missed the fact that a community built around a factory does not simply reorganize itself when the factory leaves. The workers knew things that no consultant could document. They knew the sound of a machine that was about to fail. They knew the feel of metal that would not hold a tolerance. They knew shortcuts that saved hours and problems that looked minor, but would cause catastrophic failures downstream. This knowledge was embedded in their hands, in their eyes, in their memories of thousands of hours spent doing the same tasks until perfection became automatic. That knowledge is gone now. It walks the streets of Ilion, looking for work that does not exist. It sits in homes bought with Remington wages, wondering how to make the next mortgage payment. It remembers what it meant to build something that mattered. The factory buildings will remain for a while longer. They are too large and too contaminated to demolish easily. The cost of environmental remediation alone would run into tens of millions of dollars. The buildings will stand as monuments to what was lost, not just a company, but an idea of American manufacturing that no longer seems to apply. There was an idea that held you could build a life by building things, that a job in a factory could support a family, buy a house, send children to college, that skill and dedication would be rewarded with security and respect, that a company and a community could grow together, each dependent on the other, each strengthened by the other. The idea was never entirely accurate. Companies have always exploited workers when they could. Factories have always closed when profits declined. But there was a time when the idea seemed plausible enough that people built their lives around it. They stayed in towns like Ilion because they believed their children could stay too. They developed skills because they believed those skills would remain valuable. They invested in their communities because they believed those communities would endure. That time appears to have passed. The mathematics that govern modern corporate America do not reward loyalty. They do not value continuity. They do not account for the costs that are transferred to workers and communities when companies relocate or close. Those costs are externalities, real to the people who bear them, invisible to the balance sheets that drive decisions. The story of Remington is, in this sense, a thoroughly modern story. A company that survived for more than 2 centuries could not survive the attention of private equity. An institution that had contributed to American victory in every major conflict could not contribute to the returns that investors demanded. A workforce that had maintained the highest standards of precision manufacturing could not maintain their jobs. The rifles remain, the shotguns remain, the ammunition remains. These things were built to last, and they will last. A century from now, some of the weapons that came out of Ilion will still be firing, still functioning, still serving their owners as they were designed to serve. The Remington Model 1858 revolver that a Union cavalryman carried at Gettysburg may still exist somewhere, in a museum case or a private collection, a piece of American history preserved in steel. The rolling block rifle that a Swedish soldier carried in 1867 may still be fired occasionally, its mechanism as strong and reliable as it was 150 years ago. The Model 870 shotgun that a hunter's grandfather bought in 1965 may still bring down birds every season, its action worn smooth by decades of use, but still perfectly functional. These objects carry the accumulated skill of generations. They embody the craft of workers who learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers, who took pride in precision, who built things that lasted. The workers are gone now, or dispersed, or too old to work, but the things they made remain. The numbers tell one version of the story: 207 years of operation, more than 250 million firearms manufactured, 11 million Model 870 shotguns, 7 million Model 700 rifles, billions of rounds of ammunition, contracts fulfilled for the United States military through 5 major conflicts, weapons exported to armies on every inhabited continent. But numbers do not capture what was lost. They do not capture the pride of a worker who could produce a component to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. They do not capture the satisfaction of building something that would outlast the builder. They do not capture the community that formed around the shared work, the friendships forged in the heat of the factory floor, the sense of purpose that came from contributing to something larger than oneself. For 207 years, workers in the Mohawk Valley made things that worked, things that lasted, things that people trusted with their lives. They made the bullets that won 2 world wars. They made the rifles that settled the frontier and armed the Union and equipped the armies of half the world. And now, they are done. Somewhere in America, on some cold morning in autumn, a hunter will lift a Remington to their shoulder and squeeze the trigger, and the mechanism will function exactly as it was designed to function, and the shot will fly true. And for that one moment, all the mathematics of decline will not matter at all. The thing will work. The thing will last. The thing will do what it was made to do. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps a company's true legacy is not the buildings it leaves behind, but the products it creates, the tools it puts into the world, the objects that outlast their makers and serve purposes their makers never intended. The workers in Ilion did everything right. They maintained quality. They honored their commitments. They showed up every day, year after year, generation after generation, and in the end, none of it mattered. The decisions that determined their fate were made in boardrooms far away, by people who had never pulled a trigger, never felt the heft of a perfectly balanced rifle, never understood what it meant to build something that worked. That is what Remington built for 207 years in a factory by the Erie Canal. That is what remains.